That's okay. We'll go ahead and get started. We can fill you in. So obviously this is a diverse group of organisms, but I think given the advances in new antifungals that have come out and new diagnostics, we really have the opportunity to continue to advance these diseases, which have clearly lagged behind the molds and candida. So lots of work to do, but lots of possibilities as well. So one of the things that we talked about is kind of the lowest hanging fruit is a lot of these diseases are very difficult to study in isolation at just a single center, which really begs the question for registry studies to do a lot of this work. We've done that with cocci-meningitis to pull data from the UC system, but I think would really be ripe to do that with not only cocci, but histo in different forms, certainly blasto / emanzia / emergomyces, Elon. So I think that's really one of the low-hanging fruit things that we could do pretty easily and form sort of a conglomerate of databases in that fashion. But I wanted to turn it over to others to see what other ideas people had.
So before we switch that topic, we are actually running a registry at WashU, and we're running it on a REDCap. So it would be pretty easy for us to literally just extend the IRB, include you in on it, give you an access, and have you start putting in data. So the registry already exists, at least the clinical data exists, and I would also be happy to change some variables if some people are interested in certain things that we could collect prospectively. We're actually going retrospectively now, but we're also going to be collecting the data prospectively if people are interested.
Are you getting blood, isolates, that kind of?
So if we did that, then that would require a consent. So we are at this point not doing that. But if there is a specific question that people have, then we could. There's nothing that stops us from doing it.
I mean, I think it'd be wise to collect blood and isolates on these stranger organisms for sure.
Sure, absolutely. The question is, it's the same thing we talked about with the CDC, the crypto discussion. This can blow up pretty quickly, and if we have a target for it, I'd be happy to do it, but I don't have space to just accumulate forever.
Yep. How are you funding it? Who's paying you to do it?
Blood, sweat, and tears.
Can I speak to that?
Please.
That is sort of a problem with registries that we could do in the past, and now our chairman and our folks are saying we need RVWs, and the clinical enterprise is sort of pushing us. I'm doing charts at 7 o'clock at night, much less registries.
Yeah. So, a good resident or a good fellow can go a long way to help you with getting those things, but if the years you don't have them, it's me.
I mean, it's enormously complicated to do that. We've talked about this for years in the MSG, and it's really hard to find sponsors who will help you because your blood, sweat, and tears is you're going to bleed out soon, and then there's problems. So we really need to have pharma or diagnostic companies step up and help us out with this. But there probably has to be some gain at the end for them.
Is there any way to use any of the big EMR companies that many of us probably belong to ask them to do any kind of data mining that you could then take back and use for questions? I mean, I'm sure many people use Epic, for example, and could they mine for, urine histoantigen positivity, for example, and then, give kind of a breakdown, and then you could contact those institutions and invite?
So Epic as a company couldn't because all of the data is stored locally. So Epic as a company is just a platform, and they don't ever have access to the patient level data. There are programs that can be written to extract automatically from Epic. And some of the stuff that I do is automatically extracted, and I'd be always happy to share those, obviously. But you have to take with a grain of salt that automatic extraction does come with imperfections.
The other group I was going to say, there's a group called Vizient that I don't know how many hospitals are a part of, but they have been really helpful on the stewardship side, antibiotic stewardship, doing kind of point prevalence projects. That's a lot of P's. And we're actually going to do one pretty soon with penicillin allergies. I do antibiotic stewardship for our hospital also. But if we had a specific question that they could spin, they're pretty friendly and pretty willing to help with those things, and that would reach a lot of people, even potentially outside of this room, because it's got so many hospitals. But it has to be kind of a specific question, and at a point in time, usually.
Are they able to get data outside of your hospital?
Yeah. So it kind of depends on what you're asking and what they're collecting. Yeah.
So this came up in the crypto session yesterday, and so Jerry McGuinn, who's no longer here now, he's a statistician at UAB, and he runs the EMR and Vizient data at UAB, and he has the whole data set. So 150 hospitals, 78 million inpatients, and just for fun, he looked at the crypto numbers today for 2017 in 2,000 crypto cases. And so, and they have drug data procedures, ICD-9 codes, et cetera. Certainly it would be easy to get epi data for histo and maybe more. For emergent myces, I don't know the ICD-10 code, right? I mean, that's the problem. So blasto, histo, we could do the weirder things I'm not sure we could find. But I think that's a great idea. We're going to probably use it for crypto for this group, and so let's tag on to it endemics if everybody's interested.
They actually like getting credit, you know what I mean? So I think Vizient likes that visibility of them saying, hey, you belong to us, and look, we've helped you. So they're actually pretty collaborative with a lot of things.
Good idea.
The VA may have, their electronic medical record is supposed to be sort of universal, even geographically worldwide. And so if they had the crawlers, et cetera, on their web to be able to access stuff, you could use them too.
Well, so since one of the things that came up was a lack of resources, I think some of you are aware that the federal government has a bill that has been proposed, and I think will be voted on. Pete, do you know when they're going to vote on the endemic bill? Is it this late fall?
No.
So that bill, they proposed $75 million specifically earmarked for the endemic mycoses. So there are a lot of resources potentially available for the endemics.
Well, it's
We'll see what happens. I mean, that's what they're saying.
It's a Kevin McCarthy bill, and it's for a lot of money. Bill you would have to assume as a majority leader, the bill will be approved. Will it ever be funded? Not clear. But let's go back to what Carol was saying and Bob was saying, because some of us have to be the institutional memory here, right? I mean, one of the most frustrating things that as I look back and say, what is it that I wish we could have done, or I wish we had just continued to push and do? And when I think back on all the endemic studies that we did, and we don't have the first specimen for many of those patients, even though we talked about it. I'm talking about it as early as the late 90s. Let's get DNA, let's get the organism, blah, blah, blah. And, usually funding, it was never lack of interest. It was, we just never could quite do it. And it will take money to do this, but my personal belief is that there is enough movement afoot that if we keep our foot on the gas pedal, I think some funds are going to appear at the federal level, possibly, and I think the things that they're interested in looking at right now relate to not just the clinical outcomes, et cetera, but why do people get it? Again, it comes down to that, one of the things that's tying all this together is personalized medicine, genetic susceptibility, and this is an area where there's really not a lot known. There's probably more known about crypto than there is about histoblastococcus in terms of genetic vulnerability. And so it can be couched in those terms. And we certainly have, the cases. There's just a ton to be learned. There's just a ton to be learned. So I don't think it's worth. I think it's worth continuing. I really believe it's worth pushing, because if by some miracle that funding were to occur, that would have to be part of the plan to tie it into epidemiologic studies and genetic, to make it really a robust type of plan, I don't think the government's interested in throwing $75 million to understand whether flu or ITRA works best for coccinpneumonia. I think it's got to be, there has to be much more to that. And I think that when we both talked with him and John, perfect, I mean, I think that's what we were saying, that basically this needs to be a total package, a holistic approach to a group of diseases, including the endemics, which included genetics, included the isolates, including, you know, those types of things. I wanted to ask a question to John and anybody else who would speak to this. I guess you're on the taxonomy. If we had to draw sides here, we would say that you're on the side that understands the need for a microbiologist to split and be really, really specific genetically as to where these organisms belong. We as clinicians say, wow, does it matter? And I guess the question I would ask you is, aside from the scientific curiosity part of it, where do these organisms come from, how did they evolve, et cetera, how important do you think it is to look into the genetics of these organisms from a clinical perspective? I'm familiar with, we've thought about crypto here a lot lately because now they've broken it down into 10 or 12 species. And the only value I can think of to that is if you were tracking the organism from a clinical standpoint, if you're tracking the organism epidemiologically, or if you thought there was a chance that these two organisms had different pathogenicity. Because as best we can see, they all behave very similarly. So I guess the question is, what are the clinical implications of all this splitting? And should we be more open to this?
So I think that you do want to know that. And because each little group that you find may have different phenotypes. And as you say, the phenotype could be pathogenicity, could also be drug susceptibility. So for example, Coccidioides immitis used to encompass all of cocci, and now we know there are two species. And immitis and Possadacea have different phenotypes. The spherules are different. One of them will make hyphae at a temperature, the other one makes spherules. I heard a talk at Stanford last year on veterinary medicine in Arizona and veterinary medicine in California. And the vets reported on the same breeds of dogs, and one had Possadacea, one had immitis, and the disease were different. And so I think that you do want to know that those groups, because once you can identify them, then you can start to look for phenotypic differences. If you don't know that there are two groups and you can't sort your isolates into two groups, you'll never discover them. But on the other hand, if this present state of medicine is that you treat them the same, then a clinical lab really doesn't necessarily need to separate them for treatment of the patients. But if they can separate them, it will help science, because then you know how to sort them into two piles and you can look for phenotypic differences. And this discussion comes up every meeting I'm at. In fact, I had it at lunch with the fellow that I was sitting with and with Elon. And so as to how important it is. But I think it is important. The other reason you want to know this is you can do genome-wide association studies on the host to see are there human genetic factors that predispose you to disease that affect your response. But you can also do it on the pathogen. But you can only do it on any group of organisms if it's an interbreeding group. They have to be exchanging genes or GWAS doesn't work. So for example, for fungi, if you want to do GWAS on Coccidioides, you better know if it's Possadacea or immitis. You may also want to know, is it the San Joaquin immitis or Southern California immitis? Because if they aren't exchanging genes, if they've diverged for a while, your phenotype is going to associate with a lot of variation, not just the one you're interested in. So I think it's very important to know that. And Cryptococcus, the only problem, the big mistake the people who named the Cryptococcus species made was they didn't work with Jun Quan Chung and Wieland Meyer, who'd studied crypto for a long time, so they were unhappy. And the solution would have been to name a species Quan Chungi and another one Meyeri. Would have been no problem. Yeah, they just didn't think about that. So. Or perfect eye.
The question I have is, I'm going to disagree a little bit with Peter on the issue that the government really knows what they want to do, and they really want to fund genetics and various other things. I think they have no idea what they want to do, but I think there is the possibility that a large chunk of money might actually come to your arena. That's possible. Who knows? So I think you got to be prepared for this. And I guess my question a little bit to GW is, how do we treat primary cocci? I mean, or do we treat it? I mean, this is an age-old question that's been around a long time. And I get these things coming out where there are certain camps that treat, and there are certain camps that don't treat. And, how do you put that together? And will it be put together if we do some of these studies? I mean, we already know that we spent a lot of time and a lot of money on the cocci trial and didn't get too far so far. The question is, will you be prepared, or are there groups that are together that could tackle this thing once that money might become available?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And just for people that don't know, so primary coccidial pneumonia, just from all the historical data, 97% of those patients resolve without sequelae long-term eventually. And the question has always been, can you speed up the resolution of disease by treating with antifungals or not? And so people have given sort of different versions of that. So one of those is sort of the immunology of pertussis. You treat them with antibiotics, but they actually don't get better more quickly. You eradicate the organism and they sort of cough. And that sort of resolves over time. And people have thought the same thing with cocci. You may treat them with fluconazole, but the fatigue still takes 6 months to go away. So they've done, the FLEET study is what's on, I don't know, I've heard mixed things this week actually about that study, so I don't know where that stands currently.
It's, well, I don't know about this week, but it's being reformed.
Okay, good. That's what I had heard last, but I heard something different this morning.
It's going to be reformed.
So that is to randomize patients in the endemic region that come in with community-acquired pneumonia to standard bacterial coverage versus bacterial plus fluconazole, and then sort of follow them symptomatically. They plan to enroll 1,000 people, and it's gone very, very slowly, I think for a number of different reasons. So I don't think that they're going to get an answer to that. I don't think it's going to work.
But what impressed me the most was there were camps of people that do them certain ways and others that don't do them certain ways, with or without data. Sure. So is the cocci community together where they could do things together?
Yeah, I won't answer that part, but I actually agree with John. I think Imidis and Posidaceae actually already have clinically different phenotypes. We see a lot more meningitis in California than they do in Arizona on a per capita basis. So we've started looking at the genetics of that from some of the virulence factors that we've looked at in the lab. I can't prove that. That's my opinion and anecdote. I personally think fluconazole is the worst drug for cocci from side effect reasons. But no one had ever looked at MICs before last year, and we asked the folks in the fungus testing lab in Texas to let us have all their isolate data. And the MIC 50s for cocci to fluconazole are 8. So you automatically have to give people 800 milligrams of fluconazole, and then you've got really nice mouse data showing fluconazole with crypto, and we probably underdosed some of those people, and I'd love to hear y'all's opinion, but I have become a big fan of drugs other than fluconazole for cocci. I admittedly see sort of a subsection. I tend to see the more severe patients and not the ones that are going to do well no matter what you do. But I don't think we're going to answer this question with the FLEET study. I don't think it'll probably work, but that's my opinion.
But is the community together enough
I don't think they are, no.
do kind of clinical studies or grouping together that they would all come together and say, okay, we'll use cocci as an example. and there's a whole Southwest out there, and there are pools of various people doing various things. You think that could get together because, again, all of a sudden there might be a pool of money coming here, and I think you would want to amplify all the people that you could get under that umbrella.
Yeah, if it was up to me, I mean, so the Annals of Internal Medicine paper that compared ITRA to flu, I would repeat that with one of the other drugs versus flu. And I think that any of the new drugs would be superior to fluconazole if it was an appropriately powered study. The Annals paper, in my opinion, has been misinterpreted. People have used that to say ITRA is better for bone disease, but ITRA is just better for disseminated disease. And I think that group, immunologically, they don't handle cocci well. They need a better, more potent antifungal than fluconazole for that group. And there just weren't enough patients to show true superiority across the board. They only showed superiority in those with bone disease. So if some of this money was made available for a clinical trial, I would choose one of these new antifungals that's fungicidal in vitro and in the mouse model and compare that to fluconazole. And I think, it's an orphan disease. You can do a very small study and get an FDA indication and maybe even get a drug on the market earlier than one of the bigger indications like Candida or Aspergillus.
Yeah, I think it's a good emphasis here to talk about it because all these drugs have come up and they've come through the pipeline. A lot of them have endemic activity and stuff like that. And the ability for something like Coxy that has a grading system, a history around it and stuff like that might be very attractive to have a support system around that to take another drug and use it in endemic mycoses to actually get indications.
Yeah, and I think if we prove it's superior in the disseminated patients, it'll sort of fall into favor for all the other indications for primary pulmonary infection as well.
So I had kind of two things to maybe ask about. So one, I think we talked about this 2 years ago. One of the problems with the endemic diseases is we don't really have any good really surrogate endpoint measures for clinical trials. And so Coxy has a scoring system for histo and blasto and other things. We don't really have good surrogate endpoints. And so whether that's, change in antigen level or something like that. And so as prospective studies get done or clinical trials get done for new indications, it would be nice to nest in some pathogenesis studies looking at potential surrogate endpoints, because your first study may be very large, but if you can get a surrogate endpoint, then that certainly would be nice for smaller studies and then actually do some of these new drugs coming through the pipeline. So that was one point. The second question is what about the host immunology? We talked a lot about this yesterday with crypto. With Coxy a little bit, that's the case certainly. With histo, I think histo's, the various manifestations that you see, clearly some of that's due to the host immunology, sort of Th1 versus Th2 sort of responses, and like fibrosing mediastinitis, sounds like a Th2 response to fungus. And so has there been much, interest or I guess historically or in the future for sort of more looking at the immunology of the host response to some of these endemic mycoses?
Yeah, that's a good question. So to start with blasto, from what I understand, the University of Wisconsin has sort of looked at that Hmong population that's gotten really bad blasto and has a paper that's going to come out very soon that really sheds a lot of light on the immunology of that. So in Coxy, we've sent almost 600 DNA samples to the Broad, and they've had whole exome sequencing. I don't have the data. And then Steve Holland has an intramural grant to look at that, so we send him our patient's DNA as well to look at in a little more nuanced fashion. But I'd ask the other folks about histo.
Well, isn't that what George Deep has done most of his career? Look at the T cell response. Carol, isn't George Deep? Hadn't he spent?
Use your microphone.
I am.
It's hard to hear.
Isn't George Deep? Hasn't he been looking at histo and T cells at the University of Cincinnati for forever?
Yeah, right. And he has a great mouse model and has had that for some years. I guess I wasn't quite sure what you were getting at, David, in terms of surrogate markers, because we have great clinical markers for blastomycosis especially. And I was going to bring up after the Coxy conversation, Coxy's does have this grading system for how response is graded, and they all know that out there and use it.
So Coxy does.
But blasto is just so easy to study, and we've just not gone there. We have all these new drugs now. They're old drugs. Voriconazole posaconazole, now isavuconazole, and nobody ever is done the studies to show that these are effective. Meanwhile, as clinicians, we're using them. I suspect that's true of most everybody up here.
Correct, yeah.
We're not relying on itch or flu necessarily, but we really would like to have some data that shows the other drugs work.
Right. So I mean, we use Vori, we use other drugs as well. But is that better? Is it worse? There's really no data, and so we just whatever. Patients generally do well as long as they absorb the drug, and so. But I think for severe blastos, more severe histo cases, there's not really to do a trial to say is combination therapy better than just liposomal ampho. There's not. It would be hard to do those studies because the mortality generally is fairly low once you make the diagnosis and you start treating patients, and so it's harder to, if we want to optimize therapy, thinking about are there surrogate measures.
For the blasto cases, to have a verrucous lesion melt away in a month, we really don't need the surrogate marker. And I'm a bit concerned about Vori in blasto, being kind of son of fluconazole. I use it in meningitis, or CNS disease, but I've gone to POSA before that, and we've got just some salvage studies that have had 1 or 2 patients. It'd be nice to have more drugs.
And similarly with histo, I've gone to POSA or ISA before I will go to voriconazole, partially because, as you said, it's the son of fluke, partially because there's Joe's data on higher MICs if they have fluke resistance, and then also partially because I've seen several relapses after Vori. So I've done the same thing. I've moved away from Vori for histoplasmosis.
Yeah, I think the disseminated histo cases, probably 10 to 20%, don't have any obvious immune compromise. That would be a nice study along with Coxie to have some protocol that had genetic testing done in the NIH lab.
I'd like to bring up the point that for most of the fungal diseases that we talk about here, you don't really know where the person's acquired it, but with these endemic diseases, they acquire it from the environment. And so protection or prevention is a real possibility. And if you look at the outbreaks that we see for Coxie, they're almost all preventable. If the people knew that they were at risk and if they took some steps to keep from breathing in the spores. So I think that's something for the study group to think about, especially commercially, ways to identify where Coxie is in the environment, and then also ways to protect people. Now it's this protective masks, which GERC will have a comment about in terms of firefighters. But it's possible to perhaps to give these people some amount of antifungals while they're doing that work and thereby protect them. And you guys might think about or talk about how would you conduct a trial for that? How much to use and which one?
Yep.
Yeah, so with all the fires we've had in California, we noticed that a huge amount of so just to give some background, the California firefighter service is about 80% California inmates. And so they don't physically fight the fire as far as dumping chemicals or water. They're basically digging trenches to create fire breaks, and for 8 to 12 hours a day. So they're at very high risk down in the soil, and it's for such long duration they can't and won't tolerate wearing an N95 or some other mask. And so I take care of a lot of these patients over the telemedicine system in California, and talked to the CDC actually just last week about doing a prophylaxis study for these folks. They're at high exposure risk for weeks and weeks at a time. And about half the prisoners refuse to do anything you want to do, so they would easily sort of segregate themselves by on drug and not on drug. So it's a very easy study to do, and I think, but just since they're obviously a at-risk population as prisoners, there's some issues with is that research or not. That's for the CDC to sort through, I guess. But I think that's really key.
There is no way that would be an easy study to do.
No, but I'm not
just
doing
getting
it.
that
They
through
can-
ethics.
But they just want to put them on and just follow them longitudinally. Yeah. But we see that with a lot of things. So when they added onto the Sacramento airport, they trucked in dirt from Bakersfield So you can imagine how well that went for the construction workers. So we had nine in the ICU at the same time with ARDS from massive exposure. But if they tested the soil, like Union Pacific has had the same issue, and now they're wanting to build this high-speed rail all throughout the Central Valley. But if they test the soil, and then they can either skin test people and sort of allocate them if they're positive to those sites, or offer prophylaxis. Or there's a lot of ways we can reduce exposure for these if we sort of think through it in a conscientious way. I agree.
Maybe I could bring up something controversial. We now have several tests for antigen for histoplasmosis. We have several people in the audience who have those several tests. Then there's some others in the wings as well. And so one question is, would you all be willing to go head to head and compare all of those tests in patients with histoplasmosis or blastomycosis? We have a blastoantigen as well, but more histoantigen tests. Obviously, there's some threat to somebody. Somebody might win, somebody might lose, but it'd be really helpful to us as clinicians to be able to evaluate the test together.
Yes.
Okay. Joe?
One vote.
I think that the response was yes for both.
Would you be willing to fund it?
Yeah. Let me, GR, we haven't mentioned the fact that we have a really active, it's about to explode. We have MSG15. Half of you at least on the panel are participating in this trial. It's going to enroll all patients with endemic mycoses. That's the qualifying criteria as far as an infection. What a nice opportunity to collect those collect those samples prospectively, and then test them after the study is over. And you have all of the data. You have their diagnosis. Of course, it'd be limited to histo patients, but wouldn't that be nice to have prospective data collected, saved, and then do the testing, do the comparative testing on urine samples, serum samples at different times during this. That would have to obviously be written in, but it's not a big deal. It's a urine sample and a stored serum sample. Not a big deal. If the sites are willing to do that, then you'll have you estimated 40 to 50 patients with histo that would address the question that Carol has just brought up.
I think that's an excellent idea, but I would argue that it should be for all patients that are enrolled in the trial, and possibly even at screening. So you also have patients that subsequently don't have proven or probable disease diagnosed by other methods.
No, I agree. I'm just saying that for the purposes of these two, comparing the existing histo test, of which there are several, this would be, but saving samples on the other patients would be appropriate as well.
Well, it's also possible to generate a panel of blinded samples from disseminated histo cases that could be done without a prospective study. You could do a prospective study also, but you could get an answer quickly by using specimens from disseminated cases with positive cultures.
The time to detection of disseminated histo, I think, is an important feature. Many of the patients will present as an FUO, fever of unknown origin, and if the person is also immunocompromised, then it runs up the bill pretty fast to do an FUO study on an immunocompromised host, and you can easily spend $50,000 on diagnostics, and then the histo test finally comes back several days later. So more real-time diagnostic, when the concern for disseminated histo would pay for itself in that kind of savings. And as long as I'm on the topic, awareness of general physicians on the endemic mycoses could be enhanced. Many of them will have failed community-acquired pneumonia therapy. The rate of histo in the community is not 20%, the way cocci might be. And then in terms of immunocompromised hosts, we do try to teach them when they leave the hospital after their transplant, all kinds of precautions. Don't go canoeing in Wisconsin, for example. But after a year or two, it's hard to sustain all of those precautions. Solid organ patients want to have a normal life. And in the Transnet study, a large portion of the endemics occur more than 3 years after the transplant. So how do you kind of sustain that awareness? So those are kind of the 3 areas: patient awareness, general physician awareness, and then speed of diagnosis even after someone thinks of the diagnosis. Each of those intervals are areas that I think we could improve.
Well, the turnaround time for the histoantigens, one day. So if the sample's sent, we receive the sample today and we report it today 98% of the time.
So if I could, I just wanted to echo what John said earlier about needing to understand sort of where people are getting exposed, because I think we have this general sense of where things are, and we know there's a relationship with waterways for blasto, but I feel like there are really specific niches that we can get at more. So I know that John's work may be paving the way for cocci and that, but I think blasto and histo, there's still a lot more we could go with that. Just to build up what you said about awareness, I mean, we're trying to help build that as we can. We would love to have experts actually do videos with us and if you have patients that can do testimonials and that kind of thing, I think that would go a long way in terms of getting the word out. So if you have any interest in doing that, let us know, or do it on your own and we'll retweet it or whatever. And the other thing is going back to the big data set issue. We have access to the Truven Market Scan, and I hope we can get access to actual real EMR databases at some point. So Market Scan really only gets you ICD-9 codes. You can also get drugs, outpatient drugs. We don't have access to the inpatient drugs yet, as well as the diagnostic tests that were ordered, but we don't get the results. But what I can say is that when you're looking at histodiagnostics, half of them are actually for something that none of you deal with, which is it's coded as historetinitis, but it's presumed ocular histoplasmosis syndrome, which we were shocked by. So that's one thing we're looking into there. Of the rest, about half are diagnosed by either culture or histopath. I shouldn't say that. They had histo or culture path with no serology or antigen or anything like that. So it suggests to me that these are people who are being diagnosed, I wouldn't say incidentally, but not intentionally. And so that just, I think, goes back to getting people to think about histo and blasto more. So if anyone has any suggestions for ways to get that word out to primary docs, one thing that we'd love to do is work with MSG to put together a really nice, easy, pretty diagram for primary care docs and other primary care providers about the different testing modalities, because I think there's people in our branch that have trouble keeping this stuff straight with all the different options. I think for the average doc, it's hard to think about all of that. So just a couple things for your comments. Thanks.
So the clinic to target in the modern era is the rheumatology clinic. I've had several patients over a short course of time who I diagnosed with histoplasmosis who were being treated for a rheumatologic illness. And I then went to the dermatology department and I gave them a talk about histo. And I talked about the protein manifestations, the subtleties, the complex presentations, and they started testing their patients who were kind of like, they're adult Still's disease, but they're kind of just not behaving the way they should, or dermatomyositis that just keeps getting worse with more prednisone. And in a course of about a month, I ended up with an extra 11 cases. So if we, as clinicians, want to target a population currently, I think rheumatology clinics are the way to go.
As well as their monoclonal antibodies.
Right, they're monoclonal, well, those you know, because those come in and they're dying. But the ones who are on 20 prednisone for what probably was histo all along, And they just kind of dwindle for a year, year and a half.
So can I just clarify, the people with dermatomyositis are presumed, it wasn't that they had that plus immunosuppression causing it, it was actually they had histo.
So they had dermatomyositis, so the particular case, dermatomyositis for about 18 months, high dose of prednisone kept getting worse and worse and worse. And eventually, when I was done working her up, I grew histo from blood, muscle biopsy, skin biopsy, and the old skin biopsies were GMS positive. So she had histo for a year and a half being treated with prednisone, and she was getting worse, not surprising.
I would also target thoracic surgeons. You know,
Yes.
Don't whack it before you test. You know, so.
You may have seen the article on EID this month on histoplasmosis. So part of it was they were sort of mapping their geographic suitability, but a lot of it was actually a surgery group that was actually the impetus for that. And apparently, I just corresponded with that author, and he said that and maybe people Carol or others can comment on this, but he said that surgeons in the quote unquote like known endemic area for histo generally know that if you got a nodule in the lung and it lights up on FDG PET scan that you should think histo and not necessarily automatically assume it's cancer, but that outside that area there's all kinds of people getting these open lung biopsies for presumed cancer when it's actually one of these endemic mycoses. So yeah, and if anyone, I actually wanted to get people's thoughts on that, if there's specific things that we should be thinking about in terms of trying to target those kind of long-term nodules and what to do about that.
I mean, we see a lot of nodules that get resected for lung cancer workups that, you know, are fungus, and so I would say that's not the case.
I'm kind of curious for the histo group, what are you all doing for patients before they're put on TNF alpha blockers or monoclonals?
Praying?
I mean, there's numerous people in here that could make reagents for skin tests to test those people. I mean, we get quantiferons or TB tests before we do it. I would guess in the Midwest, histo is what percent are going to be positive? 99%? I mean, 70?
70, yeah.
Okay. Well, everybody I know in college had histo, so.
Yeah. So I think Carol's data showed that most of these cases were new primary infections on TNF alpha inhibitors, as opposed to reactivation
Newly acquired,
disease.
not reactivated?
Yeah.
And they're still quite uncommon. Although we talk about them and you hear them on the news, I mean, you hear all the commercials. I mean, there have been only, 75 reported cases or 100 reported cases?
They may have just stopped reporting.
What's that?
They may have just stopped reporting, because I've got a bunch.
I mean, I've got a bunch too, but I mean, you just...
So you guys have all 75?
Your paper had quite a few, I think, but...
Because I'm at around a dozen, so...
I think we just have 3 or 4, but... I mean, it's still very uncommon, and there's lots of TNF use. I mean, just at that point.
That is true.
But I think you were getting at, should we be doing serology beforehand? And we say, no, don't do that. We don't know how to interpret it, because they send it to us, and it's like, well, I don't know what to do with it. So I think it's different than cocci, where...
It's a totally different disease.
Yeah, especially with transplants, you have a whole system worked out where serology is helpful to you. I don't think we have that with histo.
We need a H-spot test instead of a T-spot test.
There you go.
So just to change the topic back a little bit to John's topic and what Brendan mentioned about really pinning down, you know, where are the specific microecological niches, and kind of relating back towards a registry, perhaps a registry for all patients. You know, maybe it's overly ambitious, I don't know. But what about a registry for point source outbreaks? Because that's, in my mind, that's really, between that and, you know, an infection in an infant who's never traveled anywhere, but otherwise it's almost, and, you know, culturing it directly from soil. Otherwise, it's really impossible to properly map out these diseases.
You know, my concern is that most of my patients, I don't know where they got it. They got it somewhere in St. Louis.
Right. So that's fine. But if you have, you know, a family that comes in and they were, you know, demolishing a farmhouse and they all got an infection that you know, was either proven or probable histoplasmosis, it would be really helpful, particularly if it's, even if it is in a known area of endemicity, just to start accumulating that data that actually pins it down.
So can I just jump in that, sorry, go ahead, Carol.
I was going to say the CDC should theoretically could have that, but histo isn't reportable in all states, nor is blasto. So that would be one thing to go toward finding out where the disease is, to actually make these reportable diseases throughout.
Yeah, and I wish we could make reportable by fiat. It's up to state. So I think histo's reportable in about a dozen. Blasto is 5 states only. Blasto's 5 states only. So we've been talking about trying to, like there's a foodborne outbreak database that's been really helpful in trying to track those types of things. I've been trying to kind of worm our way into that and to do it for fungal outbreaks. But the problem is you got to get state health departments to do that. And I'm not sure that state health departments in a lot of these states ever find out about these things. So maybe we should find a way to make some open source kind of thing where anyone can upload an outbreak and we have to some sort of verify it there afterwards. I don't think anyone know Dennis Baumgartner, but he's a family physician in Wisconsin who's done a lot of basically in his time while he was waiting to deliver babies, papers on blasto, and he's actually got his own internal registry within Wisconsin, and I want to say he's got like 7 houses or more where there's been multiple patients in actually different families that have lived there over time, so they actually are probably getting exposed even in the house or right nearby that house, and so it's multiple where it's like dozens where it's like 2 patients in a house, and there's even a couple where there's like 3 or 4 separate people in a single house that are all getting it, which is a lot for a pretty rare disease.
That kind of redefines the sick house syndrome, doesn't it?
Yeah, he's also published on infections in indoor-only cats in Wisconsin. So that's actually, I guess that's another way to pin down exactly where they got it, because cats don't really travel.
Is there any way to piggyback on the NHSN reporting structure for CDC? And I don't know that you want to make it a mandatory thing because hospital epi and infection control already have enough things, but something where you could auto-upload, much as they're trying to build the antibiotic use database, something where you could upload from EMRs, upload specific diagnostic results, at least to get some baseline data?
I would love that, but as we talked about yesterday, Pete pointed out very well, right hand, left hand, it is a very prescribed system. So I can bring it up, but I feel like I know what the answer is going to be already.
Yeah, I meant to ask about that the other day when I didn't get a chance to. When Tom Chiller gave his talk, he said that Canada ARIS was going to, as of 2019, be on the notifiable list. And I meant to ask him, I don't know what the process is for actually getting that accomplished. I mean, he's obviously at the CDC, and so, he must know that process, but does anybody else have a comment on how you do that?
I can tell you more than you ever want to know about it.
You're sort of talking about that in a way, do you make histo notifiable? Do you make these other things more notifiable? How do you do that?
It's a good question. So it's actually not CDC that makes that decision. It's the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists. And the territories is not because of Guam and Puerto Rico. It is now, but it was back because of like the Oklahoma Territory and all that back in the early 1900s. So they're the ones that are actually making these things. And so you've got to basically politic, get enough state epidemiologists to agree to do this. We're just trying to get enough more people to initially make some of these diseases. So cocci is nationally notifiable, even though half the states, it's only reportable in half the states. We want to update that case definition, but we're a little worried that some of the people may put up enough of a stink that it might get wiped off the whole list entirely. So state epis are very opposed to adding more diseases to the list. So I really want to, one of our things is we have a consensus case definition for histoplasmosis. We want to have one soon for blastomycosis. This is not for clinical diagnosis, this is for public health reporting. That's sort of a step in that process. We're trying to build that momentum. Canada ARIS was a fight. It almost got shot down in the multiple rounds of voting that happened during that, but I think we were able to make that case that it was enough of an immediate HAI that required direct intervention, that it was a public health issue. It's been hard to make the case for public health departments to track these intensively as it is. But if health departments hear more from you, that would always be helpful.
Well, great. Well, any other comments on endemic mycoses from any of the panelists?
With the biological agents for rheumatology, I have something that's similar for the first 1,000 liver transplants we did fungal serology screening on everybody because we were just paranoid that we would ignite a cult infection. And the screening test cost about $1,000 each because it was a panel. And the only ones who were positive were patients who, when we reviewed the charts, they told their practitioner they had had a diagnosis of histoplasmosis. So we could have saved $1 million just by asking the patient, have you ever had this disease?
Isn't that all of medicine?
So then we stopped doing it, and the next 1,000 liver transplant patients, we've been just fine, relying on, we have a checklist that the nurse asks in the pre-transplant evaluation. So and those drugs for liver transplant are pretty strong. I think they're stronger than the biologics for rheumatology diseases.
Okay. I wanted to ask Elon a question. It was a great summary. I love the way you've laid it out now with the different tax taxonomy, as complicated as it is. Africa and blastoendomontia and emergomyces all seems like still very much unknown. Do you have any suggestions, having worked for a long time in South Africa, obviously very different than a lot of other parts in Africa, but for trying to better grasp the extent of the problem and what should be done?
So I don't have any quick answers for that because I think it requires a very broad-based enhancement of diagnostic laboratory capacity. It's hard to make the argument that, you know, that governments in resource-poor settings need to invest in mycology resources and not, say, TB diagnostics or, you know, crypto screening. But certainly it's out there. We have really no idea how much. There was one little orange man in Uganda, and that was a patient. There was a dermatologist from Germany that went down there, saw a patient, took a biopsy, stuck it in her pocket, and then flew back to Germany, and they did a PCR on there. But for sure, it's out there. It's how do you capture these without, you know, what are the low-hanging fruit? What's the easiest way to try to enhance that capacity? And I'm not sure I have any quick answers, you know, short of you know, general investment in ART like we talked about before, and general laboratory capacity. Certainly, if somebody wanted to make a diagnostic test for emergomyces, someone sitting in that region over there, that would be very welcome. Or even a you know, a test for dimorphic fungal disease that lacks specificity, because really we don't want to diagnose someone with histoplasma if we're missing, you know, emergomyces in a patient in an overlapping endemic area. So I'm not sure if there's any financial viability to that idea, but thought I might as well put you guys on the spot.
You know, I think the emergomyces very well may be positive in the histoantigen test. I think it's likely a cross-reactive galactomanian.
Yes, we had 7 patients that we collected prospectively with emergent mycosis that we collected urine on, and 3 of them tested positive with the IMI histoplasma urinary antigen, which, you know, is helpful for those 3, but it's unhelpful to be able to apply these in a place like Cape Town, for example, where we see 5 times as many cases of emergomyces compared to histoplasma.
Yeah. Well, you'd have to get a large enough number of cases to have samples from. We tested one case, and it was a positive histoantigen. And I don't keep track of this, but it was previously called blasto. Emergomyces in the past had been called a blasto.
Not really. It's complicated, but they were all called Emontia. So now that has been parsed out. Some things that were called Emansia are called blasto, some things are called emergomyces, and some things remain
Yeah.
Emansia for now, but it's...
Well, I think if you had the samples, it would be easy enough to see if Talaromyces and Paracoxy and Blasto are all entirely cross-reactive, and it may be the same thing.
I have a question for the group in general. You know, several of us are involved in antibiotic stewardship, and sort of fungal diseases come late to that party. But we've talked about education. That's fine. I love coming to these meetings for that. From a practical standpoint, in my hospital, the two people that I have, or the two groups that I have the hardest time dealing with educationally, are hematologists, oncologists, and intensivists. And I'm actually an intensivist, and I still don't get any traction with those folks. But in terms of the reality of it, if I want to have somebody beyond or not beyond prophylaxis at my hospital when they're going to be neutropenic or whatever, I really don't have any control over that. The hem-onc guy makes that decision regardless of what I tell them. The hospital also intervenes because the hospital will say, we want to be using this because it's cheap, and we really don't care, about the other factors that are involved. You can even go to them with data and say, hey, in our geography, we don't have filamentous molds as breakthroughs for any of our patients with neutropenia to speak of, because I've actually done that at my center. We don't have much of that. But does anybody else face these problems other than me? I can't believe that I'm insulated that way.
Yes, it's a problem just with your surgeons and ICU
Your
docs.
intensivist and your hem-onc.
I think that's a pretty ubiquitous problem. But I agree with you. Well, let's wrap up here. But thank you all for coming. Thanks for your ideas and your attention, and we'll sort of get together and present a summary over dinner tonight. But thank you all so much. Have a good evening.